After months of silence and countless conversations online, Kim Burrell has finally decided to share her truth about Gino Jennings. What she said surprised everyone, and sparking powerful reactions across the gospel world. What happens when the boldest voices in gospel crash head-on with controversy in the age of social media? The answer: shockwaves. You won't believe how two powerful figures, once celebrated for their faith and fire, suddenly found themselves at the heart of an internet storm that refused to fade. Kim Burrell and Pastor Gino Jennings, names that once commanded respect, voices that could shake a room, were now under fire. The same people who once called them anointed were now calling them arrogant. Sermons turned into sound bites, truth turned into trending topics. And in a world where every clip can go viral in seconds, both Burrell and Jennings discovered that one moment behind a pulpit could ignite a controversy big enough to challenge everything they stood for. It all began with Kim Burrell, the gospel powerhouse whose voice could move hearts, lift souls, and make entire congregations weep. For years, she was untouchable, celebrated as a queen of gospel music, her name synonymous with anointing and excellence. But here's where the story takes a shocking turn. Kim's downfall didn't come because she lost her gift, it came because of her words. In 2016, during a sermon in Houston, she spoke out against homosexuality in a way that stunned everyone. The clip spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the internet. Overnight, the woman who had filled arenas with praise found herself at the center of one of gospel's biggest controversies. One day she was preparing to perform alongside Burrell on the Ellen DeGeneres show. The next, her appearance was canceled. Her voice hadn't failed her, but the world was no longer ready to listen. That moment changed everything. Destiny took a sharp and unexpected turn. Overnight, Kim Burrell became one of the most talked about names in gospel, not for her voice but for her convictions. People across the world called her hateful, judgmental, and out of touch. LGBTQ advocates condemned her. Even some of her most loyal fans turned away, unable to reconcile the voice that once brought healing with the words that now brought division. But let me tell you, this was only the beginning. While social media exploded with outrage, the church world grew uncomfortably quiet. Many pastors chose silence, unsure which side to stand on. A few defended her right to speak biblical truth, while others subtly began to distance themselves. And then came the twist no one saw coming. Kim didn't retreat. She didn't issue the kind of apology the public was waiting for. Instead, she stood her ground, calm, confident, and unshaken. "I'm not being cruel," she said. "I'm being honest. The world just can't handle real talk." It wasn't just defiance, it was a declaration. And from that moment on, Kim Burrell wasn't just a gospel artist. She became a lightning rod for one of the most heated debates in modern faith. As time passed, more clips of Kim Burrell began surfacing online, each one sparking more outrage than the last. Moments that once stayed within church walls were now being dissected by millions. In one viral video, Kim stood at the pulpit laughing as she said, "Some of y'all are living from credit card to credit card and still talking about you got favor." The congregation chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. But the internet didn't hesitate. Within hours, the clip exploded across social media, and the backlash was brutal. People called her classist, cruel, and completely disconnected from the struggles of everyday believers. The woman once celebrated for her anointing was now trending for all the wrong reasons. And when Kim finally broke her silence on Instagram Live, hoping to clear the air, things only got worse. Her tone wasn't one of remorse, it was defiance. She didn't take responsibility. Instead, she blamed bloggers, haters, and gossip pages for twisting her words and creating chaos. What was meant to calm the storm only fueled it further. Because in that moment, Kim Burrell didn't sound like someone seeking understanding. She sounded like someone ready to fight the world back. She stated, "I'm just being real." Her tone, however, simply made matters worse. Churches banned her performances, gospel stations stopped playing her songs, and people began unfollowing her as she tried to justify herself more and more. This was the most absurd aspect of her situation. The shocking part is that what people saw on stage was only half the story. Behind the scenes, things were even more troubling. Musicians who had toured with her started to speak out, and anonymous posts about what it was like to work for her began to appear online. The woman who was once viewed as a vocal angel was now being described as toxic. Some singers described being humiliated in front of the team, being scolded for minor infractions, feeling emotionally spent, and even claiming that Kim used her spiritual authority to manipulate those around her, leading them to believe that opposing her was equivalent to opposing God. One singer described how every day felt like walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set her off. The story changed from being controversial to being concerning at that point. and people started to wonder if this was just about one woman's pride or if it was a part of something much larger going on inside the church world. This story is unique because it demonstrates how the same places that are supposed to heal people can also cause them harm. However, some fans refused to turn against her, claiming that Kim was just misunderstood and that she was preaching hard truths that people didn't want to hear, but others saw it differently. As more testimonies emerged, the picture grew darker. She became a lightning rod for one of the most heated debates in modern faith. As time passed, more clips of Kim Burrell began surfacing online, each one sparking more outrage than the last. Moments that once stayed within church walls were now being dissected by millions. In one viral video, Kim stood at the pulpit laughing as she said, "Some of y'all are living from credit card to credit card and still talking about you got favor." The congregation chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. But the internet didn't hesitate. Within hours, the clip exploded across social media, and the backlash was brutal. People called her classist, cruel, and completely disconnected from the struggles of everyday believers. The woman once celebrated for her anointing was now trending for all the wrong reasons. And when Kim finally broke her silence on Instagram Live, hoping to clear the air, things only got worse. Her tone wasn't one of remorse, it was defiance. She didn't take responsibility. Instead, she blamed bloggers, haters, and gossip pages for twisting her words and creating chaos. What was meant to calm the storm only fueled it further, because in that moment, Kim Burrell didn't sound like someone seeking understanding. She sounded like someone ready to fight the world back. She stated, "I'm just being real." Her tone, however, simply made matters worse. Churches banned her performances, gospel stations stopped playing her songs, and people began unfollowing her as she tried to justify herself more and more. This was the most absurd aspect of her situation. The shocking part is that what people saw on stage was only half the story. Behind the scenes, things were even more troubling. Musicians who had toured with her started to speak out, and anonymous posts about what it was like to work for her began to appear online. The woman who was once viewed as a vocal angel was now being described as toxic. Some singers described being humiliated in front of the team, being scolded for minor infractions, feeling emotionally spent, and even claiming that Kim used her spiritual authority to manipulate those around her, leading them to believe that opposing her was equivalent to opposing God. One singer described how every day felt like walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set her off. The story changed from being controversial to being concerning at that point, and people started to wonder if this was just about one woman's pride or if it was a part of something much larger going on inside the church world. This story is unique because it demonstrates how the same places that are supposed to heal people can also cause them harm. However, some fans refused to turn against her, claiming that Kim was just misunderstood and that she was preaching hard truths that people didn't want to hear, but others saw it differently. As more testimonies emerged, the picture grew darker, with former singers and background musicians describing a world full of tension and fear where everyone had to pretend to be okay while suffering in silence. They viewed this as spiritual arrogance rather than bold preaching, claiming that the church had spent too much time defending talent rather than character, and that Kim had become a symbol of a larger issue where people had forgotten what humility looked like due to fame, power, and applause. Meanwhile, another fire was burning in another part of the gospel world as Kim's story spiraled. Known for his fiery sermons and unrepentant teachings, Pastor Gino Jennings was starting to garner attention for all the wrong reasons. His supporters referred to him as one of the last genuine voices of holiness, while his detractors claimed that his words were ripping people apart rather than uplifting them. Pastor Gino Jennings, who had built his reputation on being bold, fearless, and brutally honest, preached like a soldier on a mission, declaring that he was exposing sin and bringing holiness back to the church. His videos with titles like "Pastor Destroys Fake Christians" and "Jennings Exposes the Modern Church" had received millions of views. His followers loved him. You won't believe how quickly the respect turned into fear once the cameras stopped rolling. Former members began sharing their experiences, and what they described didn't sound like freedom or faith. They said he was the only one brave enough to say what others were too scared to admit. But here's the shocking part. Something darker was growing behind the loud applause and shouting amens. According to one woman, she was shamed in front of the entire congregation for wearing a dress that the pastor called too worldly, and another said she had been told that wearing jewelry or makeup was a sin and that doing so would make her a Jezebel. They spoke of a system based on control, where questioning the pastor was interpreted as questioning God himself. This is where it gets interesting, I tell you. The more people who spoke up, the more forceful his words became. Rather than offering an explanation or an apology, Jennings doubled down, claiming that the backlash was evidence that demons were upset because he was speaking the truth. In one sermon, he said, "If the world hates you, that means you're doing God's work," and his congregation roared agreement. What's even more crazy is that every new controversy drew him even more attention, with his YouTube sermons gaining millions of views and drawing in viewers who didn't even attend church. But then fate took a surprising turn, and a leaked audio clip started making the rounds online, with a voice that sounded like Jennings saying, "If you start letting women lead, you might as well hand the mic to the devil." The internet took off. It was criticized for being antiquated, sexist, and cruel. His supporters attempted to defend him by claiming it was fabricated or misrepresented. Even some devoted followers, however, secretly started to question whether they had been blind. Was this vanity masquerading as preaching, or was this truly pure boldness? Let me tell you, things began to fall apart at this point. More former members came out with hard-to-ignore stories. They talked about being separated from their loved ones and being told that everyone outside the church were corrupt. Some claimed that they felt under pressure to donate substantial sums of money because they thought it was the only way to demonstrate their faith. Others claimed that despite their best efforts, they were continuously informed they weren't holy enough. The story's revelation that spiritual abuse need not always manifest as violence is what sets it apart. It can appear as quiet, guilt, and control at times. The story of one woman became viral on the internet. She claimed to have dedicated her life to helping and to have been involved in the ministry for many years. However, she was publicly humiliated when she started to raise questions. "They said that the devil had tricked me." Thousands of people who had experienced similar things were moved by her statement. "I lost my friends, my peace, and even my sense of who I was." They also started posting their stories on the internet. All of a sudden, Gino Jennings and Kim Burrell were not the only topics of discussion. Behind the walls of the cathedral, there was a much greater truth at play. Here's the startling bit though. As a result of the criticism, Jennings's platform expanded rather than contracting. With each viral video, he gained new fans who expressed their admiration for his bravery. He is straightforward. While some disagreed, some said, "The world needs more pastors like him." He was criticized for encouraging fear rather than faith, because rather than uplifting people, his comments were depressing them. The true question, I tell you, started to reverberate online at that point. Where does spiritual abuse end and courageous truth begin? The solution wasn't straightforward. Some people thought he was just teaching the same holiness doctrines that had been around for many years. Others thought that by converting faith into power, he had gone too far. The assumption that having power in the pulpit equates to being untouchable, which is a far deeper issue among the religious community, is what made the narrative so compelling. People like Jennings and Burrell had been operating for years without any real accountability. They appeared larger than life due to their charisma, talent, and influence. However, those impenetrable barriers started to crumble as social media provided a voice to the voiceless. And suddenly, the public began to see a side of gospel culture that had been kept concealed for far too long. With each new video, leaked tape, and testimonies, the flawless grins, stirring speeches, and moving music were all a part of a stage show that was beginning to unravel. It was no longer just Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings who were at the center of the maelstrom. It was now a mirror reflecting a much larger object. You won't believe how fast their names became emblems of a more significant issue within the church. On social media, people started conversing openly rather than in whispers. For the first time, people felt confident enough to share their tales without worrying about being silenced, and hashtags like #ChurchHeart began to rise. Let me tell you, things started to alter at this moment, not discreetly, but loudly and openly on podcasts, YouTube, and TikTok. Church employees, singers, and former believers began sharing their stories. They discussed giving more than they could afford, being duped in the name of faith, and being convinced that to challenge a leader was to question God. One woman talked about how she felt empty and unworthy after participating in a ministry associated with Kim Burrell. She sobbed as she added, "I was never good enough, never holy enough, never rich enough." Overnight, her video went viral, inspiring thousands of people who shared their own suffering. It becomes intriguing at this point. Her tale served as a catalyst. And soon after, a wave of individuals started to speak up. People found a community after years of keeping their church anguish hidden. They dubbed it church trauma healing forums full of confessions, some enlightening, others tragic. After missing one rehearsal, a former choir member claimed that she was humiliated on stage. Another claimed that he was informed that his financial difficulties were evidence that God had turned away from him. The most bizarre aspect was that these weren't just any old stories. There was a pattern that linked them. Leaders use power, guilt, and fear to exert control. The tale is unique since those patterns were shown in real time for the first time. Even well-known YouTube channels started to participate in the discussion. Preachers Unfiltered, a program, began examining sermons by controversial pastors, including Jennings and Burrell's. They dissected the wording, tone, and deceptive strategies employed in those sermons rather than merely criticizing them. They likened Jennings' lecturing style to well-known cult leaders in one episode. The resemblances were disturbing. The host emphasized how both frequently used fear, guilt-based obedience, and emotional control. I can assure you that viewers were taken aback. Many people who had previously appreciated these preachers started to notice things they had previously overlooked. This is the startling part, though. The criticism increased in tandem with these conversations. Burrell's and Jennings supporters battled valiantly to protect them. They said that this was only a global conspiracy to stifle truth and an assault on authentic Christianity. Bible passages and irate comments were posted in droves. However, the more they yelled, the more stories continued to come to light. The fear of being called rebellious had vanished. They had had enough of silence. They now consider the internet to be their church, a location where people might speak the truth without being asked. For both leaders, fate took an unexpected turn. Their reputation was now being destroyed piece by piece by the same platforms that had made them famous in the first place. Every quote was examined, every scathing lecture was replayed, and every old clip reappeared. Critics pointed to Burrell's previous interviews, in which she made fun of those she viewed as inferior, as proof of her spiritual elitism. Jennings's ferocious lectures were no longer merely regarded as impassioned sermons. They were being examined as illustrations of manipulating emotions. Let me tell you, the audience became divided into two realms at this time. One side fought online, and one thing emerged: they're human. Everyone makes mistakes. The other side countered, no, this is abuse hiding behind religion. The church was undergoing permanent change. Preachers were no longer heedlessly followed because of their charisma or skill. They were beginning to probe further and pose more challenging queries. The fact that this moment was spearheaded by non-famous individuals was what gave it such strength. Ordinary believers served as its leaders: Sunday school teachers, choir members, and former church musicians. They emerged as the new truth-tellers. They were careful not to undermine faith. To protect it from hypocrisy was their goal. They talked about the psychological damage caused by hearing that they weren't sufficiently anointed, the humiliation of being shunned by a group of people who were meant to adore them, and gradually others began to be inspired by their bravery. The most absurd aspect was that some members of the church started to concur. They began to acknowledge that, although they had been too scared to speak up, they had witnessed similar actions in their own leaders. An image of a man saying, "We were taught to never question the pulpit," went viral. His remarks struck deep because they were real, but perhaps that's why the harm lasted so long. What started out as gossip had now evolved into a movement, with people talking about more than just Burrell and Gino Jennings. You won't believe how deep it went. What had once appeared to be isolated controversies now appeared to be symptoms of something much larger. For years, talent had been used to hide bad character, and charisma had been mistaken for calling. They were discussing the system that allowed this kind of behavior to grow unchecked. Let me tell you, this was no small change. People who had abandoned church started to rediscover faith, but on their own terms. And entire online communities began to form around healing, truth, and transparency. The same people who had once been afraid to question their leaders were now demanding accountability. The interesting part is that they began to realize that calling out abuse was not rebellion, but responsibility, and they no longer felt that being spiritual meant keeping quiet when something felt wrong. Some longtime fans of Burrell and Jennings even started to speak out, saying, "We loved your gift, but we can't excuse your behavior." Once hailed for her unrivaled vocals, Burrell now stood as a warning of how easily power can change a person, and Gino Jennings, once praised for his fire and boldness, now became a symbol of what happens when that fire burns without compassion. That simple line became the beating heart of a new kind of revival, one that focused on purity rather than performance. The story is unique because both of them demonstrated, in their own ways, how unbridled power can blind even the most talented leaders. Their paths took an unexpected turn, and as the months went by, the shockwaves continued to spread. They had built empires with their voices, but now those same voices were resonating with controversy. People realized that faith didn't require blind loyalty, and churches started holding talks about emotional and spiritual abuse. Pastors were questioned by their congregations. Gospel events that had previously praised silence now began with prayers for healing, and the phrase church hurt had gone from being a painful whisper to a national conversation. In a podcast, a former musician who had collaborated with Burrell said something that touched millions of hearts. The gospel is still pure, but we've turned performers into gods and pastors into kings. That's not faith, that's idolatry. Let me tell you, this was the most powerful part of all. People were learning to separate the message from the messenger. The most absurd thing was that this reckoning didn't destroy faith. Rather, it refined it. Those words went viral overnight because they captured everything people had been feeling but couldn't express. This was the true problem, not the scandals or the sermons, but the systems that valued fame over truth. A new generation emerged, one that rejected glitzy stages and well-known preachers in favor of leaders who lived out their beliefs, were honest, humble, and thought that the pulpit was a place of service rather than a throne, and that if someone refused to take responsibility, they might not belong there at all. People were finally realizing that truth didn't have to be loud, it just had to be real. This realization was quiet even among believers who had once followed Kim and Gino. You could honor someone's past work without justifying their current mistakes, and you could love their gift without justifying their flaws. As the dust settled, a beautiful thing began to happen. Listeners who had previously felt abandoned by faith began to rebuild it. Survivors of spiritual abuse found community, and the same internet that had revealed the darkness was now being used to bring light, because when people began speaking the truth, others began to heal. You won't believe how full circle it came. The gospel world, which had been rocked by scandal, was at a crossroads and faced with a clear choice: either keep exalting personalities or go back to the core of faith. For many, the choice was simply to follow charisma over character and mistake arrogance for anointing. Change really started when the church realized what it had forgotten: that true religion was never about who shouted the loudest, but about who loved the deepest. The truth was whispered by the same people who had previously sat in silence, not with celebrity or fear,